As mentioned in the previous video, J.L. Mackie argues that there are no objective values. He also tells us that all moral claims assert the existence of objective values, so all moral claims are false. But there's a catch. Mackie actually tells us that there are two types of objective value. There's one type that doesn't exist, but the other type does exist. And this video explains how to tell them apart. The type of objective value that Mackie says doesn't exist is the type that he called objective intrinsic prescriptivity. It's a property built into certain types of action, such as theft or rape, one that's independent of its relationship to any other thing, and that commands us to do that which is morally required or not to do that which is morally prohibited. In the previous video, where I covered Mackie's arguments that aimed to show that there are no objective values, this is the type of objective value he was talking about. The type of objective values that do exist, well, they're not intrinsic to what has value. It's a relationship to what has value and some set of desires or interests. Mackie writes, quote, "Something may be called good simply insofar as it satisfies or is such as to satisfy a certain desire. But the objectivity of such relations of satisfaction does not constitute, in our sense, an objective value," end quote. So he's saying that something can be called good, and he is claiming that its goodness has objectivity, but this type of objective value is not the type of objective value he was talking about when he says that there are no objective values. Are you properly confused yet? Well, let's see if we can make sense of this type of objective value that does exist. And how can we tell it apart from the type of objective value that, according to Mackie, doesn't exist? I think we'd benefit if we develop two different terms for these two types of objective value. The fact that they're both called objective value creates a whole lot of confusion. We can't tell which type of objective value we're talking about. So I'll call one type of objective value intrinsic values and the other type relational values. Okay, now intrinsic values are those values that reside wholly in the object of evaluation and doesn't depend on the object's relationship to any other things. And yet they somehow command that we act or refrain from acting in particular ways. The way that the wrongness of rape commands us not to rape. This is the type of value that Mackie called objective intrinsic prescriptivity. Relational values, in contrast, do depend on how the object of evaluation stands in relation to a set of wants or interests or desires. Relational values could be called subjective values since they depend on desires, but if we're seeking to reduce confusion, this might not help. Relational properties are real. They can be studied scientifically, and statements about how one thing stands in relation to another are not a matter of mere opinion. The following sentences refer to relational properties. I am in Colorado. The Earth orbits the Sun at a distance of about 150 million kilometers. The keys are on the table. All of these sentences report how one thing, whether that thing be me or the Earth or the keys, stand in relation to another thing, to Colorado or the Sun or the table. What I want to stress here is that these sentences, even though they report relational properties and not intrinsic properties, are still objectively true or false. When true, they report facts of the world, and they can't become true or false just because we change our mind. Seriously, it'd be nice if my keys appeared in my pocket just because I believe that they're in my pocket. But it's not going to happen. Next, statements in which I describe relationships between me and things in the world are also objectively true or false. Here's 3 examples. I am in Colorado. I'm recording a video on objective value. I have a scar on my thumb. If you, the listener, would utter these exact words, the statement might be false. But the fact that a statement is true if spoken by one person and false if spoken by a different person doesn't make the statement merely a matter of opinion or subjective. It merely reports the objective fact that you and I are different. So what about statements that express personal preferences? Statements like, I like living in Colorado, or I prefer Diet Dr. Pepper, or I have an aversion to pain. Well, these are as objectively true or false as the previous statements. In the same way that I have a scar on my thumb, I have a preference for Diet Dr. Pepper. You might not have the same preference, but then again, you might not have a scar on your thumb. We haven't left the realm of objective truth. We just reported the fact that we are different in some ways. Given that I like living in Colorado, one of the objectively true facts we can report about Colorado is that Colorado is such as to fulfill my desires regarding where to live. And Diet Dr. Pepper is such as to fulfill my desires with respect to the taste of things that I drink. Recall Mackie's word, quote, something may be called good simply insofar as it satisfies or is such as to satisfy a certain desire. What we can say about Colorado and Diet Dr. Pepper is that, as a matter of fact, they satisfy or is such as to satisfy certain desires. What we've said so far about likes and preferences also apply to dislikes. We can fit pain into this model if we simply note that pain is something that I desire to avoid rather than something that I desire to have. So being in pain is such as to thwart my desire to not be in pain. That makes pain bad. The important implication of all of this is that at least sometimes when we call something good or bad, we're not saying that they have objective intrinsic prescriptivity. We have some set of desires in mind, and we're reporting on whether the object of evaluation satisfies or is such as to satisfy those desires. In saying that, for example, Colorado is a good place for me to live, or it's a good idea to pick up some Diet Dr. Pepper when I go to the store, we're saying nothing more than that each of these are such as to fulfill my desires. But that's a fact. They are such as to fulfill my desires. So these types of claims are objectively true or false. What determines whether they are true or false is whether the reported relationship between the object of evaluation and the relevant desires actually exists. This is not the type of objective value that Mackie says is required for morality, the type that doesn't exist. So now, on Mackie's account, moral claims, if they are claims that something has objective intrinsic prescriptivity, are false. However, the fact that an act is such as to fulfill some desire or set of desires can in some cases be objectively true. There are a lot of different relationships between objects of evaluation and desires. And perhaps we can find a relationship between certain types of action and certain desires that captures most of what we want to say about morality, but without making morality's false claim of objective intrinsic prescriptivity. I'm going to put that question off for a future video. The purpose of this video is simply to explain that there are these two types of objective value. Something can be objectively good in virtue of the fact that it has an objectively, intrinsically prescriptive property. At least, it could be good if those types of properties exist. Or something can be objectively good in virtue of the fact that it really does satisfy, or is such as to satisfy, some set of desires or wants or interests. So, Mackie's claims that there are no objective value in the first sense doesn't imply that there are no objective values in the second sense.